top. Adrian Cowin is the Senior Meteorological Office at the Ronaldsway Met Office. Hello, Adrian. Good to have you along.
Oh, yeah, Andy. Fast am I.
Fast am I. So when you first started, 35 years ago?
Indeed.
It was the weather. Now it's the climate. It's the climate.
Absolutely.
I want to talk to you about three acronyms that came up in front of me, and I want you to explain it. COP24, IPCC, and UKCP18. What are they?
They're all snazzy titles, aren't they?
Yes.
So they capture the imagination of the media.
COP24, what does that mean?
Okay, that was the Conference of Parties. And that's a gathering of international representatives, scientists, politicians. That's part of the United Nations, really. So it's a specific big group of people, the Conference of Parties. And the latest one, COP24, was held in the autumn last year in Poland, and that made the headlines quite widely.
IPCC.
Okay, so they're the erstwhile body of scientists and some researchers and editors. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
UKCP18?
And there's the last one there. So that's a focus group that works off the back of those other two groups and their reports. So it's the United Kingdom Climate Predictions 2018. So that's a working group with focus on the British Isles.
Okay. Let's focus on what it's going to mean day to day to the actual person on the street in the Isle of Man. Climate change is something we hear about. It gets bandied around all the time.
Absolutely.
And to normal people on the street, they're just two words. So how do you, personally or professionally, see climate change?
Okay, well, climate change is the general trend in the global energy balance over a period of decades or more. So some people say climate change can be measured in as little as a decade, but the more accepted definition of climate change is to measure it in chunks of 30 years or more. And that's the sort of length of period that is concerning all these reports on climate change. Not so much what will happen in the next 5 or 10 years. It's more what's going to happen in the next 20 to maybe 100 years.
Overall, at the top of your mind, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you realistic? Are you a pragmatist? Where does Adrian Cowin stand on climate change? Because you were mentioning to earlier, you did applied physics at Preston Poly.
Well, indeed, yes. So that
and you can't change the laws of physics, can you?
You can't do that, can you?
So obviously, you are a scientist.
Absolutely.
You're a scientist, and scientists rely on facts, empirical data.
Absolutely.
Climate change, in your opinion, is that open to opinion, or is it something that is just going to happen?
It is something that is going to happen, and it always has done. And there's two types of climate change. There's the natural climate change, which occurs over periods of centuries and longer, and that's caused by a whole load of things, but mainly the energy balance on the planet. And that's happened over many, many thousands of years. There's the second type of climate change, which captures the headlines and is measurable, and that's the man-made climate change, the change that people make on the climate of the planet.
Okay, how long has man-made climate change been something that's been a significant part of the equation, do you think?
Well, I think it's quite widely accepted. It's since the industrial ages. So we quite often talk about the pre-industrial times, and the reference point for that is the period 1870 to about 1900. After that, the world started to have industry and produce all sorts of nasty things into the atmosphere, so-called greenhouse gases and burning carbon. And so man's input into the atmosphere began to cause anthropogenic change, the climate change of that century. And right up until now, some further changes in the climate as the world's industrial countries continue to want to make more things and burn more fuel.
I'm going to mention one word, and that's China, because obviously everyone gets fired up about climate change and everyone wants to make the least possible carbon footprint. While ever you have China doing what China does, can we make a ha'porth of difference?
Well, this is the great concern. There's these big industrial countries that still are generating a lot of their power for their industries. And the big players that you've mentioned are China, but also there's India. And there's still some parts of industrial Europe who use a lot of coal in their power stations.
Germany
and Poland. Poland produces 80% of their power from coal-fired power stations, and so they've got a big carbon footprint.
So let me just go back to Adrian Cowin, the scientist, Adrian Cowin, if you like, because you're playing part fortune teller as to what is going to happen, really. And everyone talks about climate change. Everyone draws a parallel, or although a parallel's drawn between extreme weather situations and climate change. Is there an undotted line between those?
So there are some links between climate change and weather patterns, and those are still being argued about and explored and researched. But I'm a believer in climate change. The evidence is there physically, and also the links to the weather patterns. I also think there's evidence there, both internationally, nationally, and locally.
When did you come to the conclusion? When were you convinced of climate change?
I think probably about 10 or 15 years ago, I was starting to see things. The climate change was linked to weather patterns, and we were measuring also a change in the climate of the Isle of Man.
What's happened on the island?
Well, the Isle of Man since the mid-1980s has seen a steady rise in average temperatures. And we've been charting those now for the best part of 30 years. Prior to that, the temperature was just bumping around plus or minus 0.1, 0.2 of a degree either side of average. But since the mid-1980s, there's been a steady rise in both the maximum average temperature and the minimum average temperatures. And quite stunning when we graph that we get a change over that period of about 0.8 to 1 degree over that period.
And where has that change come from? It can't have come from activity on the Isle of Man. That's global?
Right.
That's global.
That's
isn't
global.
It?
So that's must be down to a general change in the atmospheric global temperature, and also an element of the average sea temperature as well.
What? And obviously we're close to the Gulf Stream as well.
Yes.
Is that affected in any way?
Okay, well, the Gulf Stream thankfully still exists, and the ocean currents of the planet are very important.
Yeah.
But there's concerns that as the oceans expand and gradually warm, the nature of the ocean currents could start to change, especially as we have the influence of extra fresh water getting into the global oceans from ice melt. And fresh water input as well. That might change slowly over a period of decades the nature of the currents in the ocean, including the Gulf Stream.
And these are melting icebergs and glaciers.
Absolutely, yes. And one of the biggest melters, so to speak, are the glaciers of Greenland.
Right. And how would that affect the Isle of Man?
Okay, so the North Atlantic itself will see more in the way of fresh water running into it. And you'll start to change the sort of thermosaline contributions to the Gulf Stream. And the Gulf Stream generates by having cold water sinking southwards from the Arctic Circle area, for instance, heading southwards, and the return current from the tropics is the top current, the Gulf Stream. So there's a thought that if you start to upset that balance of water density, water temperature, the exact nature of the Gulf Stream may change.
And that's one of the what I wanted to hear you identify. Nobody quite knows, do they?
No,
Adrian?
they don't.
Nobody quite knows. So
absolutely.
On which side do we err? Do we err on the side of caution, or we just say Mother Nature will sort this out?
Well, the general thoughts are over a period of maybe a century or two that the Earth does do very well generally in sorting out its energy balance. But
now you've mentioned this half
yes.
a dozen. Energy balance. What does it mean?
Okay, so you're looking at the energy balance of the planet. The input of the sun is the driving mechanism for heat for the planet. We get the most heat near the equator and little heating at the poles. So the Earth energy balance tries to sort all that out, evens it out by distributing the hot air from the equator, sends it northwards, and the cold air near the poles, the North Pole, will tend to sink southwards. And where the two clash, they sort of mix and average out. And in that mixing zone, of course, is where you get weather systems, which is my bread and butter, weather systems and weather fronts and the jet stream. So it's that global energy balance that is going on all the time that may start to be disturbed by climate change.
In a way, it's funny, you may or may not accept this, but I always think of weather almost like the financial markets, because people make money on the trades in financial markets, and everything happens when things clash, when things meet low and high pressure, when there are anticyclones, when stuff happens in the weather. That's where that's where something happens. And for years, and obviously you've studied this for many, many years, there are weather systems. The general public, we don't know much of it, but we know the jet stream. We hear about the jet stream. We hear about the ocean currents.
Absolutely.
These are meat and drink to you, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely they are.
So on the Isle of Man, you mentioned natural stuff that's happening, and presumably we're talking about coastal erosion, the fact that Kirkmichael is slowly disappearing, the Point of Ayre gradually getting towards Scotland. That will happen come what may, won't it? Or is that a direct consequence of man's interference?
Well, those natural changes will occur and happen and always have done and always will do. The concern about man-made changes to the climate is that a warmer climate, and it is pretty much globally accepted now that the climate of the whole planet is warming, and we've got local evidence of that. A warmer climate can carry more moisture and more energy. Therefore, we're talking about the atmosphere being more turbulent, more stormy. You can end up with more gales. You can end up with more rainfall events, heavy rainfall events. So the weather, if you like, becomes more frequent, more extreme, more often. And that has an impact at a local level on the Isle of Man. If we experience more heavy rainfall events, more gales, it would increase the rate of coastal erosion over and above the natural coastal erosion.
Right. The weather also has effects on civil life, because there are umpteen industries that need to know about the weather. Water companies, local authorities, anybody who plans floods and coastal defences, forestry organisations, anybody who lives in a low-lying area or by the coast. Tourism needs to know it, the agricultural industry, fisheries, the construction industry, and the energy industry. Yes. Everybody's got a stake in this, haven't they?
Absolutely. That's the nature.
And they all come to you for advice.
They tend to. So all of these people, all industries, all governments need to think about the impact of climate change. What do we need to do in terms of planning? What do we need to do in terms of infrastructure? We need to adapt. We need to be more resilient. And there's a whole host of things that feed out from the impacts of climate change.
Yes. Normally we hear of, I suppose, one of the times everybody knows about the Met Office is TT. What's the weather going to be like? How far ahead can you plan? How far ahead can you plan in terms of weather? How far ahead do you know what's going to happen?
Okay, for actual weather events, we like to think we're accurate out to 7 days, and sometimes you can push us to 10 days or so. So that's the weather, the here and now, the day to day. And that's the sort of the daytime job that I'm in, of course. But the bigger picture on that is to watch how that might be changing, particularly in the winter months, due to the impact of climate change. And the climate change, as we said at the beginning, is something that is happening gradually in the background over periods of decades.
AD, what do you say? You must meet people who say, what do you do, Adrian? You say I'm a Met officer, and they say, what's all this rubbish about climate change? When you meet a skeptic, you must do.
Oh, yes.
What do they say to you? What do you say to them?
Well, of course, the biggest one I guess is they mostly say, well, there's always been climate change, there always has been extremes, and the Earth has known cold spells and there's known hot spells. And I accept all that, and that stops them in the tracks normally, because they didn't expect me to say I accept that there was natural variation in climate change. But then I try to impress upon them that there's growing evidence, measured evidence, of the impact of humans on climate change, and it's changing the rate of climate change. So yes, we have seen temperatures fall and rise historically, but we're now seeing a general rise over and above the background variation, and it's the rate of rise which is of some concern to me as a scientist and also a person who lives on a lump of rock in the middle of the Irish Sea.
Is there anything physical, specific you could say would happen if, let's say, and everybody talks about rising sea levels, what are the sea levels around the Isle of Man rising?
Well, indeed, and indeed that globally the average mean sea level rise is recognised and measured, and that includes around the British Isles and the Isle of Man. And this is of great concern for planning and infrastructure when you've got coastal communities that may be impacted, and we already are, by wintertime gales and high tides. Now, if the background sea level rise is going to continue to happen, and it is being measured, and the climate prediction models are right, we're looking at a sea level rise at the very best, or should I say at the very least, of 25 centimetres. And the worst case scenario, if all our international friends keep pumping out lots of carbon into the atmosphere and making it warmer and warmer and making the oceans warmer and warmer, by the end of this century we could have an extra 94 centimetres of sea level around the Irish Sea.
94 centimetres in English is?
Okay,
Inches?
Yes, we're looking at about 33 inches.
33 inches?
Yeah.
Nearly 3 feet?
Yes.
Which would kiss goodbye to Paul Dewey in Ramsey. All sorts of things would happen. There would be walls around the Isle of Man.
Well, indeed. So that's the worst case scenario if there's a large climate input. So you're talking about large carbon emissions continuing. Now, of course, all these IPCC reports and targets to limit the global temperature rise to either 1.5 Celsius or 2 Celsius in comparison to the pre-industrial times would mitigate, and the global models indicate would limit that effect.
Can we turn the situation round that quickly?
No, it's going to take
the analogy that's always drawn is a container vessel at sea. It takes 20 miles to stop it, 5 miles to turn port and starboard and what have you. It's going to take a long time. If this has been happening for over 100 years, it's going to take a while to slow down.
It will, absolutely, yes. So even if all these international governments and industrial areas made the changes now or over the next 2 years, the carbon footprint and climate change effect will still be rising. But if they limit or reduce their carbon footprint over 5-10 years, after that we'll get what's called a carbon overshoot in the planet. It will continue to rise for a little bit longer. It's got momentum. It'll keep moving upwards. But then if we have managed to reduce carbon input, greenhouse gases, and even the talk about capturing carbon from the atmosphere and freezing it, for instance, and storing it underground. Bizarre sort of theories. But then you could start to reverse the global warming. But you're talking about a period of 20 to 60 years, if you can achieve that at all. But we look at last year as an example. The carbon footprint emissions into the atmosphere were some of the highest ever last year, 2.7% up last year on previous year. So there's no sign of it slowing down.